am Olivia Kudranowicz, and I did my research paper and presentation on wrongful convictions. In recent years, there has been an increased spotlight on the criminal justice system in regards to wrongful convictions. The ability to exonerate wrongfully convicted individual is due to the ability of DNA testing and the work of persistent people and programs. Although we are able to return innocent people to their homes, why are there still so many people being wrongfully convicted? And how do we ensure that the number of people being wrongfully convicted in an initial trial decreases? These were some of the questions that I had while doing my research. DNA exoneration is the use of testing DNA from the original crime scene and testing it again with the accused DNA. So the first DNA exoneration actually took place in 1989, and since then there have been 2,551 exonerations in the United States. And roughly about 25% of all those exonerations were due to improper forensic science use. The Innocence Project is an independent profit organization that was founded in the 1990s. This is one of the biggest and most widely known organizations that have worked to combat wrongfully convicted individuals. Their mission is to free innocent people, prevent wrongful convictions, and create a fair and equitable criminal justice system. They use DNA and other scientific advancements to prove wrongful convictions. In addition, they are working to improve case law through targeted legal work, pass laws and implement policies to prevent wrongful convictions, support exonerees after their life in prison, rebuild, educate on research that supports legal and policy work, and work to build network of other organizations that are dedicated to combat wrongful convictions. But since the Innocence Project has been founded, they have had roughly 375 DNA exonerations. And of those, 21 of the exonerees were on death row that were not killed, and roughly 70% were had eyewitness misidentification. One of their biggest cases was Malcolm Alexander, the exoneration of Malcolm Alexander. He was in prison for 38 years before being exonerated. He was originally convicted of rape, but there is no DNA to test that. And another key factor in his case was that his lawyer was disbarred after neglect and abandonment complaints. So in 1979, Alexander was convicted of rape. The woman was a white woman who was grabbed from behind at an empty store. She was then taken to a small private dark bathroom, raped from behind, and had a gun held to her head during this act. And a year later, in 1980, Alexander had a consensual encounter with a white woman who had asked him for money, but she later accused him of sexually assaulting her. So the police took that information and threw Alexander's photo in the photo array that they showed the original rape victim from 1979. They showed her his photo in the photo array, and she tentatively picked his photo as her perpetrator. Again, remember that she was in a dark bathroom with her perpetrator behind her the entire time. So there's very limited ability to see, but she still picked Alexander as her perpetrator. Later, they put Alexander in a physical lineup of suspects, and the victim picked him as her perpetrator. Once again, they used his photo, and she confirmed that he was the perpetrator. Later, it was known that blood test typing on the rape kit was never sought out. In addition to Alexander's attorney failing his duties as an attorney, he failed to make court appearances, failed to file important pleadings. He did not make any opening statements. He failed to cross-examine the witness. regarding the identification of her perpetrator. So all of this led the Innocence Project into taking this case. They learned that the rape kit and semen-soiled towel was destroyed 4 years after Alexander was convicted. DNA and evidence like this should never be destroyed years after the case was open and closed. So that was one mistake on the officials' part. However, they got lucky and found hair evidence from the original crime scene. They found 3 strands of DNA and were able to examine and analyze those hair strands to DNA of Alexander and the victim. And they came back as negative. They did not match each other, which meant that there was another individual at the crime scene that matched that DNA. This led to Malcolm being exonerated. There are multiple reasons for an individual to be wrongfully convicted. This may be due to junk science, which is forensic science that has no scientific meaning and is not admissible in court. These techniques are not admissible in court due to their lack of validity and credibility. They typically are comparative forensic techniques, which take 2 unique or items or images and compare them to determine if they have a common source. The issue with this is it's more of a more likely than not comparison than an exact perfect match. This is why it should not be used in the court of law, but it still may be used as partial evidence. Some of these examples are latent fingerprints, hair analysis, bite mark analysis, and eyewitness testimony, in addition to official misconduct is also a big key in wrongful convictions. So maybe, here we go. Latent fingerprint analysis is taking a comparison of a complete or partial impression from an unknown subject to a known subject or known print. It's used to determine whether the 2 prints came from the same source. This is tricky because of reverse reasoning, which is when the known print is highlighted and you focus on the similarities between the known and unknown print instead of focusing on the key differences. In comparing fingerprints, you need to look at both similarities and differences because the differences may outweigh the similarities and mean that they are not a match. Hair analysis, on the other hand, it compares microscopic features of hair to determine if the known person is the source of the unknown hair. This has a lack of validity because 2 strands of hair could have the same exact characteristics but come from 2 completely different sources. Bite marks. Bite marks analysis is the examination of a mark left on a victim at a crime scene, and it compares the marks of a dental impression taken from a suspect. So this is tricky because the skin distorts so much after a bite mark with time that you cannot determine if they are truly a match. As you can see in the photo, the one on the right, it's more elongated. The bottom teeth look like they're more close together compared to the right. That's from the same person, but just after a little bit of time, the skin already distorts it and changes and kind of mushes together that you would never be able to tell that they were from the same person. So this is not admissible in court because of the lack of credibility. In addition to experts don't even have a standard procedure in determining if bite marks are the same or not. So that's another reason why it is not admissible in court. And then eyewitness testimony. This is when a witness or a bystander saw or was near the crime and they are testifying about it in court about what they saw. This is tricky because there are so many factors that go into an individual remembering any type of event, let alone a traumatic event. So in remembering an event, the weather, day, time, sunlight, age, height, mental health, physical health, distance. Those all play a factor in remembering what you saw, especially trying to pinpoint someone's face. And this in turn leads to an influence in what they say in their testimony. They may believe that they saw this, but it was completely false, or their memory distorted it, or the trauma distorted their memory. And then when the individual is testifying, they may have influence as well based on the suspect's gender, race, age, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. If they find that information out later about the potential suspect, that may change their whole story and their whole memory, and be like, oh wait, maybe he was like that, or maybe he wasn't. You never know. It's very tricky, and you can't pinpoint a memory. In addition to factors that play a role in wrongful convictions, official misconduct is a key issue. This is when an official officer or person of the court influence an individual to make a confession, or they influence evidence or hide evidence and important information that direct the conviction to a specific person. One big thing when interrogating and interviewing a suspect or an individual, it is a very controversial topic and technique. It's called the Reid technique. This is the use of persuasion, coercion, manipulation by officials during an interview or interrogation to get them to confess. The issue with this is they're very harsh techniques, and so it tends to lead to false confessions. There are 9 steps in the Reid technique, which are direct confrontation, shift blame, minimize suspect denials, acknowledge what they did, reinforce sincerity, offer alternatives, pose an alternative question, lead suspect to repeat guilt, document a suspect's admission or confession. Because of the Reid technique and the use of interrogation and interviewing, false confessions can be very common, and that could lead to a wrongful conviction. False confession is when a statement is given by a person that incriminates them in a crime that they did not commit. There are 3 types of false confessions: voluntary confession, coerced compliant confession, and coerced internalized confession. A voluntary confession is when the accused is in a vulnerable state or may have a psychological problem at the time. They believe that they need to be punished for the crimes that they committed, or they may believe that they're covering up for another individual. Coerced compliant confession is when an individual confesses to the crime just so that they can get out of the situation that they're in, whether it may be an uncomfortable state, more of a torture state. They just want to get out of there, so they confess to be able to leave the room. And then the last one is coerced internalized confession, and this is when the officer or official convinces the individual that they actually did commit the crime. There's also official misconduct during lineup or suspect lineups. An officer may influence the witness or the victim by pointing or making subtle signs to a specific individual that tends to influence the victim or witness's decision on who they think actually committed the crime. This can also happen with pictures. They may change or enhance the picture to make the victim or witness pick that picture. Here we go. Okay, sorry. And with all of this, there is a huge impact on the criminal justice system, but there has also been a lot of changes that have happened because of it, and good changes. DNA exonerations leave a long-lasting negative effect on lawyers, judges, witnesses, investigators, police officers, other people involved in the case because of the fact that they were wrong. And to combat this, there have been new policies and procedures put in place, but it does take a long time to implement and to fully make that change. Some of these changes have been to increase the intensity of laboratory and testimony accreditation. So this would be having more checks and balances to ensure accountability and transparency of both the experts and the witnesses that are talking in front of the court. Another thing is to get rid of old forensic practices. So things like junk science that I mentioned earlier, those are getting work to be fully removed from the court system and not even being allowed to be used as evidence because of their lack of validity and credibility. In addition, they have been adding safeguards to protect an individual from being wrongfully convicted. This means providing inmates or better access to evidence during the appeals process and giving more access to DNA evidence or their DNA evidence. And then over 500 jurisdictions, local and state, have implemented the requirement of recording interviews and interrogations. This allows the court and the judge to see the circumstances behind the confession. You get a better understanding of what led to the confession, or you can see the body language and how the individual was looking, or if they're under distress when they gave that confession. You have a better understanding of everything that encompassed it, so that you can either agree or disagree or reevaluate that confession. In addition to having a huge impact on the criminal justice system and the forensic science community, there's a very large psychological impact on the inmates or the people that were wrongfully convicted. First of all, they never expected themselves to be going to jail or prison for X amount of years. So that in and of itself has a huge toll on you, uplifting your whole life and throwing you in a small little cell. I couldn't imagine what that would do to you. Because of that, they have personality changes, maybe anger issues, or become more solemn. They may show symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety. They may resemble a military veteran or even a torture survivor. And a lot of times they turn to substance abuse, whether they're in prison or once they are able to be released. They turn to substance abuse and have a very difficult time reintegrating into society, having that stigma of being a released incarcerated individual, whether guilty or not. That still has a very big stigma. Also learning how to work in an unstructured environment. Being in prison, you have a very mundane task of things to do and very structured program. When you're out of prison, you get to do whatever you want. So that is very difficult after being in prison for a very long time, and it's very difficult to cope with. In addition to trying to find a job and trying to rebuild relationships, it takes a big toll on that individual. Not only does it leave it on the individual, but also their families. They suffer from victimization and ostracization of their own family member being in prison. That has a big toll. People talking about them, saying things that aren't true. It's a lot to deal with. They struggle to find meaning relationships with others in their community, friends, family, and the individual that is in prison. Have feelings of estrangement and detachment. And then once that individual is released, they feel a lot of pressure and responsibility in the successful reintegration into society. Since they have been the ones that are in society, they feel it's their job to help make that smooth transition. But no matter how much you help, it is still a struggle for that person that is being released. But it's a lot of pressure on the family members, and that can take a toll on them too. And it can also make their relationship even more estranged than it already was. It may hurt the relationship more. And then in addition, there's also a big psychological impact on the original victim. They may have feelings of guilt, fear, helplessness, devastation, depression. I mean, their wounds are reopened when the case gets opened up again. It may be 2 years, it could be 10, 20 years. They have had that time to cope and learn from the situation and kind of deal with it on their own, and now it's being opened up again and they have to go through everything again. Like that, I cannot imagine how you handle that. You finally were in a good place and now you have to go through it again. And those feelings that they had previously may be more intensified than they were originally. They may have more compassion. You never really know, but it does have a big impact on the original victim. We cannot pinpoint one particular area within the conviction process that we can change or take out to stop an innocent person being convicted. But there needs to be change and reform to all areas of the court system and the forensic science community. New advancements in technology allows old forensic techniques to no longer be applicable and appropriate. Techniques and systems need to be held to a higher standard, as well as individuals testifying in court. They need to be held to a higher standard of accreditation to help decrease the number of wrongful convictions in the first place. There are many organizations and individuals that are working to free the incarcerated, but more needs to happen and more needs to take place in order to stop this. The system needs to be more proactive in this matter and avoid the potential of a wrongful conviction instead of working after the fact. It needs to be a more process, there needs to be a bigger impact in the conviction prior to being convicted instead of the aftermath. We can work through the aftermath, but let's try not to. So if at this point you have any questions, I live alone, so I don't have an audience with me, but that is all I have. Thank you.